All right, friends. Well, let's get started. Um, if you haven't already, please introduce yourself in the chat. It's really nice to see so many folks. Share one thing that brings you joy. A couple of things I just wanted to call out from the chat already. One, Liz is getting started on her kitchen renovation. Good luck. These things always go a bit harder and more challenging and sometimes more expensive than you thought. Jessica in South Carolina, one of her children is off at camp and he has FaceTimed her every day, which is always a question of how the kids will react. Aubrey just got a PS4 and is really excited about playing video games. I actually haven't played video games in a couple of decades, and then came across them, played a little bit last week, and it's just blown away by the quality of what's out there. So that's pretty cool. Lynn of the Grand Canyon Conservancy, she is experiencing temperatures under 100 degrees in Arizona, which is a joy in itself. Carolyn in Michigan is going to her granddaughter's piano recital, which is pretty awesome. Jeff's daughter just got married, which is pretty cool, out in North Georgia. Not to be outdone, Bridget had two daughters. Bridget from King's College had two daughters engaged this summer. Mary Jo's son just graduated, or actually will graduate on Friday, from FSU, Florida State University, in finance. So congratulations, Maureen, and to your son. Go Seminoles. Congratulations with that. We are going to get started. So we're going to talk, I know summer is just getting rolling, so it's a little bit much to talk about fall, but we'll talk about what do you need to do now to be ready for the fall? Specifically, we're going to look at planned and major giving, which somewhat coincidentally, you all said is the thing that actually your organizations are increasing their focusing on and decreasing your focus on small donor gifts. So we'll talk about that in a bit as well. One other note is that this session is good for CFRE credits. So these are professional development credits. Many of you did this. I actually saw Maureen. What was making Maureen happy in the chat is that she's able to get her certification from CFRE in large part to these webinars. So this is good for 1.0 credits. My colleague June is going to drop a survey in at the end of the chat, the end of the session rather. So keep an eye on that and just make a note. So pretty simple and straightforward, but very cool to be able to help. Here's the agenda. We won't read it out loud. Big thing to know is the recording and the slides will be sent around later today. So you can take notes if you want to. You can sit back with your tea or your coffee if you prefer. Or if you think I've got, my colleague Ted really needs to hear this, we'll be able to share it with you. So you can share it with Ted later in the day. Quick intros. I've been lucky to meet a lot of you. My name is Patrick. I'm the co-founder and co-CEO of an organization called FreeWill, alongside my wonderful co-founder, Jenny. Usually I live in Austin, Texas, where I recently moved from New York. Right now I'm in Park City, Utah for a few weeks, just escaping the massive heat. And we are lucky to be a remote organization. Speaking of organization, really blessed to work alongside 200 amazing folks, lovely, smart, a lot of fundraising experts, a lot of engineers and designers, some lawyers who are also great, a lot of good folks. And we actually just passed $6 billion raised in terms of bequests and stocks and QCDs and crypto. So that is really cool. We're really proud of that. So if you're on the call from FreeWill, hope you're celebrating a little bit today as we cross the 6 billion mark. Okay, and then one last thing before we get started. We normally like to give away some books as a thank you for joining. And usually those books are either a mix of sort of historical context, how did we get here? Or something particular around what's persuasion, or how do you connect better with donors, or things like that. And as we head into fall giving season and beyond, which is going to include a pretty messy midterm election, potentially a recession, et cetera, one book our team thought of is this book called The Untethered Soul, which is about mindfulness. And so it is a really thoughtful book. It's a #1 New York Times bestseller by Michael Singer, which is just a little bit sort of how do you find a bit more peace, and what are some particular practices and things like that. So really, really thoughtful book. Read it a few years ago, loved it, recommended it to some friends. And we figured, going into some chaos, what better way to be helpful? So we give this away to about 20 folks every time because obviously sending it to all 800 people on the call gets a little expensive. And so just make a note in the survey if you'd like a copy, tell us where to send it, make sure to include that address, and we'll be able to send it to some folks. And if not, you can obviously buy this at your local bookstore or online, as you might think. All right. By the way, for those of folks that have won books in the past, it's always great to know what you think of them. So thank you for all those people who've sent some notes in and things like that. All right, so how's your week going? A couple of things we're seeing. we're seeing some downshift in terms of how happy people are over the course of, since the early part of the summer. So if you have thoughts on why that is, that would be, feel free to enter those in the chat. Also, a little bit more anxiety as we go into the rest of the summer, and generally the red bar, blue is happiness, by the way. Yellow is anxiety. Red is people that are feeling eager, which is good and excited. And then green is lonely, which we've been tracking from the pandemic. And interesting to see that tick up a little bit as well. Second thing is we've asked people how confident they are in hitting their goals this year, and you are seeing a bit of a drop from the beginning of the year. And so just noting that, and hopefully some of the skills and the tactics that we'll talk about later in the session are going to help that a bit. But just if you're feeling a little bit more nervous about hitting your own goals, know that this is actually somewhat normal in the community. And so we'll keep an eye on that. All right, so let's dive in. And the main framework here is we're going to talk about what's happening, what happens in the fall, what's happening in the world, what is that likely to mean for giving? And then we'll pivot after that to say, what do we actually do about it here? So first big trend in the fundraising space is that events are really back. So in 2020, nearly 80% of nonprofits replaced an in-person event with a virtual event. Just 3.5% of folks in 2021 said they plan to shift back to fully in-person events in 2021. So that's a meaningful shift. But what we're seeing is that with many restrictions being lifted across the country, events are making a really big comeback in 2022. Obviously, you still want to be taking precautions. This is less of a instruction and more of just a trend that we're seeing. When we asked you all, well, we'll talk about that in a second. What we're seeing is that a lot of hybrid and online fundraising events were really important for nonprofits. So those of you who hosted virtual events actually use it to reach brand new donors. For a lot of reasons, there were people who deeply cared about your organization who were unable to come to in-person events even before COVID. And the switch that happened really allowed folks. So what we see is that both virtual and in-person fundraising event attendees are likely to donate in addition to registration costs or participation costs during the event. So these are worth noting. And 40% of those are likely to donate more than $100, right? So one big takeaway here is when we think about our events, make sure that there are additional asks on top of tickets or something else, that it's not just the upfront piece, that we're again asking for money at the event. When we asked you all, are you doing hybrid, in-person, or virtual events? A little bit under 2/3 of people are doing some in-person events. About 30% are doing some hybrid. A greater percentage, a little bit under 40, are doing virtual events. And then let's call it 10% are saying, hey, we're just not an event organization. We don't do any of this. So interesting to see this mix of hybrid and virtual. We'll talk about the values of hybrid events later. There are certainly some ways to get that right and some ways to get it really wrong. Other thing we're seeing, right? So other big trends that are different than fall last year is that giving out of IRAs continues to accelerate. So giving from your IRA account, this is called the qualified charitable distribution. You'll see it a lot as the QCD, that's what we call it, by eligible donors continues to grow. The average size of a QCD in 2021 increased 35% over 2020. And nonprofits report a 67% lift in median gifts from 2019 to 2021, meaning the sort of median number of gifts that an organization gets is about 2/3 higher in terms of how many gifts they're getting, on top of these gifts growing in terms of average size. So what you're looking at is a near doubling in a relatively short amount of time. This is a really big deal. 4 times as many nonprofits cited qualified charitable distributions as the gift type with the most untapped potential for 70+ donors compared to cash or stock combined, right? So this is clearly the path forward for the next few years from donors over 70. These are really, really valuable. We'll talk more about those a little bit later, but just make a mental note that if you don't have an organizational focus on qualified charitable distributions, this is the time to get that going. Third insight, we are now seeing more competition for donor dollars already, and boy, is that about to pick up in the fall, right? So in 2020, $14 billion was spent on the presidential election, and that is more than double previous records for presidential election spending, right? So just say it again, $14 billion, more than double previous records. Now, what does that mean? It means that the midterm elections are not likely to reach the presidential level in 2020, but they are likely to be larger than any other previous midterm spending. So how do we start to think about working around this? Well, the first thing to know is that political campaigns can only take cash with some pretty rare exceptions. And so during the midterms, and what we mean by the midterms is not just election day, but October and September and late August, as political giving really picks up. And a lot of your donors are going to be asked every day by some campaign. You can focus on non-competitive giving types, right? So things like stock or crypto, especially donor advised funds, bequests, et cetera, face no competition from political campaigns. And you can access these from your donors even as that competition for the $200 gift heats up. The other thing we're seeing across the industry is that nonprofits are increasingly moving away from asking for just cash and giving donors more option. And so what we see is when folks do ask for cash, that's what they'll get. And the average gift is about $125. But a study by Classy showed that the average one-time donation was nearly 50% more when nonprofits offered more choices, PayPal, digital wallets, et cetera. Right? So thank you, Classy, for that research. And then more giving types usually means bigger donations. So as we're moving folks away, right, we can look at some of the research from Fidelity. Right? Fidelity, largest donor advised fund in the country right now, the average grant size out of a donor advised fund is a little bit under $4,500. And now compare this with your cash number, it's a little bit under 40x as big. More than $330 million was contributed, again, from Fidelity in crypto, right? Compared to $28 million in 2020. So crypto is exploding, which is not just more crypto giving, but also the average crypto donation is about $11,000. Now, this is what, 100 times, a little bit less than 100 times larger than your average cash donor. And so we're seeing that more and more nonprofits are using this lever, right? How do we reach our goals? We reach our goals by getting bigger gifts from the same people. How do we get bigger gifts from the same people? We change the way they give, right? This is really, really valuable. And so as you see this catching on, let's take a hard look at this. We asked folks whether they were putting increased, decreased, or about the same focus compared to last year on different giving types. Now, many few people said decrease. So people said we're putting increased focus across the board. Okay, not that helpful because you can't put increased focus on everything, but we can look at the proportions, right? So the smallest amount of increased focus is on small donor cash. And instead, what people are moving towards is major cash gifts, bequests, donor advised funds. You see that more than half of nonprofits say, yes, we're going to up our focus on QCDs. A little under half say we're going to up our focus on stock. And you can see how few people are decreasing focus here, right? So just summarizing this again, small donor cash is going to be one of the most challenging ways to hit your goals. Whereas we look at major cash gifts, bequests, et cetera. And these are really the path forward for a lot of nonprofits. And so you see this whole strategic shift really over the last 10 years, but accelerating over the last 2 years, a move away from cash, a move away from small donors into other types of giving, really, really important. Other big trends, I mean, just enormous trends that are accelerating is mobile adoption. So donor traffic on mobile outpaces desktop for nearly every campaign type. Nearly a third of all online gifts in 2021 came from mobile devices. This is going to be up and up and up. 50% of all nonprofit website visits in 2020 came from mobile, and more than 81% of emails are now read on mobile phones, up from 50% just 5 years ago. So some of you were in our writing session a few weeks back. What we talked about is how important this is because it changes the way we write email. If you are reading email on a smaller screen, like a phone, which is 4 out of every 5 emails being read, now we need to be shorter, punchier. We need to make sure our images work for this. And so when you are reviewing the emails you're going to send, if you only have them on your giant monitor or your desktop or your laptop, make sure you're also looking at it on your mobile phone and reading it that way, right? So imagine you're walking somewhere, you're busy, you get a new email, you read it on your phone. What does that feel like? As opposed to just sitting down at your office desk and reading it that way, which is actually not the experience of most of your donors. Other things we're seeing, end of year giving days continue to dominate, right? So 10 times more money is donated on Giving Tuesday compared to an average day of the year. 30% of all donation volume happens between Giving Tuesday and December 31st. For those of you that don't know, Giving Tuesday is the first Tuesday after the American holiday of Thanksgiving, usually ends up late November, early December. Emails and other solicitations on these dates get twice as high conversion rates. So it's not just that more email is sent, people are converting. I think they're also giving larger amounts compared to any other day on average. And so this is a big deal. When we look at some of the big events, now look at this. So about 70% of folks are participating in Giving Tuesday. That's cool. What we're seeing, an enormous jump in participation around some of the big planned giving events, right? So nearly a third of all nonprofits surveyed are participating in what's called Make a Will Month. We'll talk a lot about that in a second. Massively important for philanthropy. And then what we call NEPA, which is in October, National Estate Planning Awareness Week, right? So Make a Will Month is August, by the way. You see nearly a third of organizations are participating here. Really a huge shift from where we might have been 4 years ago. And part of this is nonprofits recognizing the importance of planned giving overall and bequests. Remember that graph earlier, a huge number of organizations are increasing their focus on bequests, but also we're seeing the role of urgency within planned giving. And that's why these holidays and big events are so important. Other things to note, some surprising trends, right, that we wouldn't have realized until we really looked at the data. So Google searches for things like Make a Will increase sharply in the spring and the fall, right? This is when people are doing their estate planning. You can't make planned gifts without doing estate planning. So the fall ends up being one of the best times to approach donors about estate planning and legacy gifts. Also, most of you said that most planned gifts come in the fall and the winter, right? So the falls are a little overlap of people searching the most and historically the most gifts coming in. We can look at some of the trends over time here from Google searches. And what you see here is roughly the fall and the spring, right? That's what these big arrows are in terms of when do we see these peaks in people looking to do estate planning. So this is over the last 5 years or so. Really interesting data at a national level to see how this sort of cyclicality happens, right? Most people wouldn't have expected it. We often get a lot of questions. Oh, do people make all their wills over the holidays when they're around family? Not really. It's not the thing they want to do most, right? It's sort of on their to-do list. They'll do it at work, or they'll do it sort of in the slower periods of spring and fall. Last big insight that we wanted to share before we get to some solutions here is that the interest in finding the best charities, right? Best charities for X, right? Best charities in Pittsburgh, right? Best charities for the environment spikes in December, especially in the first few weeks of December, right? So we need to be ready for that. Why is this? Well, obviously people are getting their minds around end of year giving. They're searching for recommendations. They're ready to give, but they're trying to figure out, to whom might I give? Let's take a look at what this looks like for environmental charities, right? So the Google search term, best environmental charities. Some of you are environmental charities. Check this out. You see, we've got 5 peaks across 5 years. They are basically all the first and second and third week of December, right? Look at how few people are searching this, and then how everybody's searching it in a relatively short amount of time. So what does it mean? If you are in the results, and we'll talk about how to get in the results. If you are in the results of best environmental charities, you are getting a huge influx of new donors, of end of year giving that you might not have expected and is not part of your plan. And so this becomes a really valuable asset. And we'll talk about how to make sure you're part of that conversation in a second. So, right, these are the big things happening in the world. We're seeing increased search in the fall in planned giving. We're seeing that we got to be ready for December in terms of other searches. We're seeing a shift towards diversity of giving. We're seeing the election become some competition for fundraising donors. We're seeing the return of events and some other pieces. So what might we do about these things? Well, let's talk about some steps right now. What I'm going to tell you is embrace hybrid events, but also avoid hybrid events. So what do we mean by that? Well, hybrid events are obviously combined in-person and virtual events. The mistake that people make is trying to do them at the same time. A hybrid event at the same time is sort of like a houseboat, in that it's not a very good house and it's not a very good boat. And so what you really want to do is make sure you put your full attention into each of them and make them excellent for that audience, as opposed to just having someone with sort of a live streaming camera or chasing around, or your executive director trying to figure out how to make sure the audience at home feels included instead of talking to your biggest donors. Attention spans are much different for virtual versus in person. And so your virtual event is probably going to be 45 minutes or an hour. Nobody's really having in-person events that are 45 minutes or an hour, right? Unless it's sort of a luncheon on a Wednesday. And so this gives you a chance to really focus on your core audience, as opposed to trying to split the baby, which ends up worse off for everybody. Obviously, we want some online giving tools for both. And remember how we talked about the different areas of focus in terms of giving types? Let's make sure that people can donate not just cash, because that's how you're going to end up with these much smaller gifts. So that's one, right? Let's think about events and think about doing them separately. The two big lessons on events, just to summarize that quickly: don't do them at the same time. Make sure we're specializing them for the audience. And then two, make sure that we're opening these donations at events in different ways and not just taking cash, which is going to be much smaller. Second piece, two crucial planned giving campaigns that you can see are being widely adopted across the country. So if you're already doing these, great. If you're not, think about joining other folks. These two big campaigns: one, National Make-A-Will Month. Two is what we call National Estate Planning Awareness Week. Internally, we affectionately call it NEPA. In August, nonprofits raised nearly $500 million in legacy commitments. Nearly 30,000 Americans made their estate plans for the first time through FreeWill here, and just an enormous sum of giving. Why does this work? When we started thinking about National Estate Planning Awareness Week and Make-A-Will Month, I was like, this is silly. Nobody cares about these things. But it turns out it really works. So why is that? More than 2/3 of the country doesn't have an up-to-date will or estate plan. And to take action on this, people really need a reason to make a will and a reason to do it today, right? The second part is the hardest. Everyone knows they want an estate plan. When you look at the surveys, the number one reason people don't have an estate plan is they say, I haven't gotten around to it yet. In the absence of an estate plan, there is no planned giving. And so the idea that you have a reason to do it right now, and I know that everyone like me is doing it right now, creates enormous behavior change. It's one of the most powerful things we've seen in all of fundraising. These campaigns have all these elements together. You provide donors with a will-making resource, or just other tips on how to do it. You're able to capture a lot more legacy gifts from bigger groups of supporters. Plus, you can give people a chance to inform you of bequests that they've already committed in their wills. Couple tips here, right? So obviously, remember the interest spikes in the fall. So August and October. August is a generous definition of the fall, but we'll do it. And how do we actually frame it in a way that helps people take action? Part of it's resource framing, and part of it's social proof. So resource framing is you providing information or even an avenue to make wills. Doesn't have to be, right? And talk about how other people have done this as well. That's social proof that we talk about a lot. But if other people are doing it, other people like me are doing it, I want to catch up, as opposed to being the first one. How do you say this? The research shows that the research that we have shows an email about one topic, and that topic is make a will for National Estate Planning Awareness Week or Make a Will Month. What we call standalone email, by far the most valuable, right? So 85% of these emails generated new bequests, which is pretty outstanding, given the average bequest is $60,000 to $100,000. Just as an example, I won't read this out, but you'll have it in the slides. There's a couple of things that we talk about here. So we talk about it being a resource. Check out this first paragraph under that big write your free will. Everyone needs a will, whether they're 18 or 80, and there's no better moment than now to find some peace of mind. What's happening in this single paragraph? One, we're making it clear that this is for everybody. And so a lot of organizations are getting planned gifts from people who aren't even donors yet because they're providing this resource. Second thing, we're showing donors who get this, who might be older, that they're not being targeted because they're older. And that creates much less defensiveness from that, right? This 18 or 80 language is really important, because if you're 80, you think, oh, this is for everybody, it's not just for me. If you're 18, you say, oh, it's not just for older folks. So it's a very inclusive language that's quite useful. And we talk about there's no better moment than now. People really need a reason to get off the sidelines when they're doing estate plans. Here's another example from our friends over at Happily Ever After Animal Sanctuary. Great pictures. And one of the things that animal shelters do quite well is talk about the value it provides to the pets. And so if you're thinking about, if you're an organization that deals with children, that deals with pets, that deals with something else, having extra reasons why this is important for you can be quite useful. A couple other tips here for National Estate Planning Awareness Week. This is in October. You want to use time-sensitive framing, right? So we want some urgency behind it. This is probably your last big chance of 2022 to secure more bequest intentions and really hit those goals. And where do you say this? Again, dedicated focused emails and follow-ups as well. Great. So big trend happening. If you're not already on board here, make sure to do it. Really, really, really important. And as many of you know, we are really in the early days of what's called the Great Wealth Transfer. What the Great Wealth Transfer is that over the next 20 years, there'll be about $70 trillion passed on as baby boomers age. By far the biggest wealth transfer in human history, likely the biggest and most important moment for philanthropy since the invention of money. So really big things. Over the next 15 years, this is going to be one of the dominant funding sources for most of your organizations. All right, tip 3. We talked about the massive acceleration, the rise of qualified charitable distributions. Leaning into this early is really important. So just for a recap, and some of you are already experts in here, but some of you are going to sit here and say, what are these things? Well, let's spend 30 seconds on that. Qualified charitable distributions are tax-free gifts made out of your IRA. They are valuable because they lower a donor's taxable income instead of increasing deductions. And they meet what are called required minimum distributions. This is the money IRA owners have to take out once you turn 72. So a couple of things to note here before we get into some of more of the stats. Why is lowering a donor's taxable income instead of increasing deductions important, right? And let's just sort of make sure we have our terminology right. A deduction is saying, I do my taxes, I made X amount of money, and now I can start taking deductions. Well, one of the challenges is that in 2017, a law passed by Republican Congress and then President Trump. And what it did is it raised the deduction, the minimum standard deduction. And so actually deductions didn't have any value for most donors. In fact, 90% of Americans no longer itemize deductions on their taxes for a variety of reasons that we won't talk about right now. So that's one. A lot of your older donors are not itemizing deductions. And so what qualified charitable distributions do is they lower income. And so they're perfectly tax efficient at any income level. And that's really valuable. And then second, the government says, hey, all this money went in tax-free. It's not, it's not an estate planning plan, it's a retirement plan. So at 72, you have to start taking money out. And all that money is going to be taxed ordinary income tax rates. So avoiding taxes on that is really, really valuable. 85% of you reported you saw an increase in the value of QCDs in 2021. 71% of organizations received more than $10,000. And keep in mind, a lot of these are quite small. So this is really important money. Nearly a third received more than $50,000, and so on and so forth. So what do you do here? Well, we want to include these in the fall. We want to include these early if you have a high percentage of 70+ donors. And the odds are that if we look at American demographics and giving demographics, you do have a high percentage of 70+ donors. Orgs that marketed qualified charitable distributions were 3 times more likely to receive more than 10 of these. And so this is really important. Now, why is doing this multiple times meaningful? Well, partly people are still, a lot of folks are turning 72 for the first time because we've got these baby boomers. There's a ton of folks, something like 10,000 people turning 72 every single day. So it's new to them. But also we're adding urgency because these gifts have to be done by December 31st to meet that minimum distribution threshold. A couple important things. You want to be the first people to reach donors about this. Before they take their RMD, most people are not waiting until December 31st to take it. and before they donate it elsewhere, right? So we are on the clock already. So waiting till the end of year is not really an option. You may want to start adding this in your summer outreach on top of your fall outreach. Some sample language you can use. The money in your IRA went in pre-tax. So it's going to be taxed almost any way it comes out, whether you take a distribution or even if you pass away in 30 years. That's why this is such a good way to give. Donating directly from your IRA avoids any taxes and allows you to preserve the post-tax money you already have, right? This is in that smart giving threshold. So a couple of you were with us about a month ago when we focused on how do you actually do fundraising during a recession? And one of the things you can do is start talking about smarter ways to give, ways that help you save. And so a qualified charitable distribution actually helps your donors save their post-tax money by giving away pre-tax money. And this ends up being a really powerful message. All right, a couple other things. So we've talked about QCDs, we've talked about planned giving, we've talked about events. You want to make sure that your non-cash giving types are available, especially as we go into election season. So things like stock and crypto and DAFs, these folks, people are already looking to give assets, and you want to have these links on your donate page, right? We can't say this enough. Your donate page is where most of your donors go because that's where you've told them to go. And so do not shoehorn them into giving you $100 when they could be giving you a $10,000 stock gift, right? Really, really important as a way to hit your goal. The corollary here is getting the systems in place now. Make sure we have a simple process. Donors, especially on things like stock giving, can get hung up for hours hunting down the right forms, or sometimes they have to wait to hear back from you if you don't have the brokerage information. You know, they may be calling you after hours, you're not calling them back. At that point, the motivation is gone. So you really want these systems in place before end of year, really in the fall, make sure it's happening so you'll lose fewer donors and raise more money. Great example that we use sometimes is the Southern Poverty Law Center. And you can see on their checkout page, they've got a couple of really big things on PayPal, stock, donation through your IRA. This is really what best-in-class fundraising looks like. And you can bet that the average donation from this page is going to be dramatically larger than yours might be if you're only taking cash on that page. Number 6, we talked about, this is the last thing we'll talk about here in terms of insights. We'll talk through some next steps as well. Is that interest in finding the best charities spikes in December, right? We talked about this. So how do we get in front of the folks who are searching for it? There's really 2 ways, right? The first is what we call SEO, meaning when I Google this, and you should be Googling it today, if not right now, right? Best charities in your region, right? Best charities in the topic area that you focus on. So you want to use keywords. First one's SEO, which means, do I show up there? Using keywords across your websites. You want to write an article, why the Pittsburgh Land Conservancy is one of the best environmental organizations in Pennsylvania, right? Write that article with that title. So when people search best environmental organizations in Pennsylvania, you show up. Second piece here is basic Google Ads, right? So you can bid on keywords like this related to your sector. Also, Google for Nonprofits, and many of you will know a lot more about this than I do, gives free ad credits to eligible organizations. And so you can use this, and I think get up to $10,000 in AdWords for bids like this. The last thing we want to do is when we're Googling this, right? So right now you're searching it, and obviously there's some other search engines, but the lion's share of traffic is going through Google. When you search it and you find something, an article that says, best humanitarian organizations to donate to this December, and you are not in it, you can reach out to that journalist or that blogger and say, do you mind if we share a little bit more about our work and why you might want to include us in this article if you update it? And then when they update it, that article that's already number 1 or number 2 or number 4 that people are looking through, you'll be part of it as well, right? So these are relatively light-lift things that can drive an incredible number of new donors. We highly recommend you think about doing this over the next few months, well before we get into the peak search season. Okay, so those are a couple of big tips. There are a couple of resources that we'll share beyond this, beyond the slides, beyond the recording to help you out. The first is this book, Love the Book by Michael Singer. Highly recommend it. Hopefully you are one of the winners as well. My colleague June is going to add a link now in the chat. And so feel free to click there and fill out that survey. It's super helpful to us. Other things we are going to include for folks who can fill out the survey, just so we have your contact information, some plan giving templates around NEPA and Make a Will Month, and then some effective tips for how do you actually market plan giving. One of the things we didn't talk about, the great part about Make a Will Month being in August is that the rest of your organization is sort of happy to let you have some more email space that turns out is wildly effective because people are just thinking about fewer things. All right. Before we close out, I'm just going to give you 60 seconds about FreeWill because I'm really proud of a couple of things our team did this week. First, we got this note from a partner, which we loved and just wanted to share. It really made us smile. They said, not only are we booking bequests valued at over $1 million, we're getting full contact information for constituents that we only had email information for. But this is my favorite part. The support offered by the FreeWill team from sales to implementation is top notch. And then she wrote, this has been the best vendor experience I've had in my 20-year plus career. So that's awesome. And just a huge shout out to the folks at FreeWill making that possible. We just ran a customer survey, something called CSAT, customer satisfaction. We got 100% on it, which is sort of unheard of. It's actually our first time. So we've been making all these changes, trying to sand off some of the rough edges. First time we ever got 100% customer satisfaction. So that was awesome. And then we received some notes from the folks at Susan G. Komen, who obviously do amazing work. And this is what they said. They said, FreeWill has helped Komen attract new donors through the national featureship. 84% of bequests have come from donors that are outside the database, which is awesome. And then capturing information from donors that are giving through QCDs, stocks, and DAFs has always been a challenge for Komen. Using the tool made it really simple for us to get donor data. So they actually recorded a video for us, and we're going to send it to you after the fact. So we just ask that you take 90 seconds to watch that and learn a little bit more. And that allows us to put all our focus in this conversation about the big trends and what to do about it. Great. So if you're, by the way, our marketing team wants me to tell you that in the survey, you can also make a note if you want a one-on-one meeting about bequests or stocks or crypto, et cetera. And also, who's this a good fit for and who's it not? Right now, our focus is on US nonprofits. So we know a lot of folks here from outside the US, and apologies for that. And the folks that end up being good fits are usually folks with $1 million in annual donors or at least 5,000 email supporters. So that sort of makes you a good fit for FreeWill. All right, so coming back to big topic at hand, we're going to take a 1-minute break so that I can read the Q&A. I'm also going to drink a little bit of water because it's been a lot of talking. And Park City, by the way, is at 8,000 feet, so everything's a little bit drier with less oxygen. And we'll go from there. Great. Okay, so some really good questions. And I'm going to make one more note and then we'll just answer all the questions here. So again, just fill out the survey if you can. Our next webinar is in 2 weeks, and we're going to talk a little bit about maximizing end-of-year fundraising. And so we'll dig a lot deeper into some of the things we've briefly chatted on today. Also, we're about to release a plan giving report and a stock and crypto report, which should be really interesting. And so keep an eye on that, and you can sign up in the survey as well. Okay. Ooh, some folks are in Utah. Cool. We can grab coffee or drinks or decaffeinated tea, depending on what your religious persuasion in Utah is. There's a lot of chamomile tea hanging around here. So a couple questions. Is cryptocurrency engagement primarily from major donors? Melanie, the answer is yes and no. So the no is we wouldn't primarily look at your current major donors as the folks who are likely to give crypto. Crypto ownership tends to be a bit younger. Now, the corollary to that, or the inverse, is there are a lot of crypto major donors out there that are potentially untapped. So some wild stats to share. more than half of millennial millionaires have more than half of their wealth in crypto, right? So we can tap into this audience. There's a really, really big avenue there for new major donors, which I know is the sort of holy grail for a lot of folks. And so that's really interesting. Patrick, what is your advice regarding cryptocurrency focus in the short term, the next 6 months? From Christine. I would say if you are a large organization who is getting a lot of giving, think tens of millions of dollars, make sure you have a cryptocurrency option already, right? People should be trying to give you this. You'll be getting larger gifts. You'll be uncovering some major donors who you might not know about. That is a huge win. If you are a relatively small organization, you might want to have an option, but it's unlikely to be a huge area of focus unless you dominate with tech donors or younger donors across the board. Is it better to have the virtual event the day before or the day after? It's a good question. Whatever works on your calendar. We find that virtual events tend to be good on sort of weekday evenings. And so, I wouldn't necessarily do it on Saturday in the middle of the day if you have a Friday or a Sunday event. But it's a good question. If anyone else has thoughts on before or after in the chat, that would be great. How does the volatile stock market affect stock giving overall? Joanne, you would expect a slight decrease in giving. But remember that when we read the news about the stock market being down, it's not inaccurate, but it's a little bit misleading. And what we mean by that is people talk about, oh, the stock market's down 4% from its January peak. Well, that's all well and good, but that 4% was a split second in time. And so most of your donors still have appreciated assets that they bought at some other time. And so stock giving should still be highly encouraged at this point, right? We'd have to see a 2008 level crash for stock giving to no longer be a good idea, right? Not the sort of relatively small downslide we're having as well. Does the plethora of giving options on the landing page confuse or discourage the completion of a gift? We try to avoid this, and this is Melanie's question. Great question, Melanie. Melanie, some people would have thought that, and the data from Classy and others shows that it's just not true. Now, why is that? Well, part of it is that the other giving types are so much larger, right? That getting a single stock gift is the equivalent of getting potentially 100 cash gifts. And so you want to make sure that option is there, right? So good question, common question, and one that seems totally reasonable, and it turns out the data proves otherwise. Malika says, please say again the requirements to be considered for FreeWill. Are there exceptions for smaller orgs? Malika, what we would suggest is, especially on the request tool, you can always point people to freewill.com for free. And so we make that available to smaller organizations. We just don't want to end up in a place where it's not a good ROI for you. And so we tend to be pretty restrictive there. But the free site is obviously free, so you can share as much as you want. There's another question around crypto crashing. Another thing to think about is that crypto is very much the same way. Excuse me. Crypto's about doubled in the past 2.5 years. So even though it's down from its super high peak last year, there's still a ton of people with appreciated assets. And so crypto is a really big avenue as well. Okay, last question. 2 questions. Well, Cecilia says, can you repeat how many people turn 72 per year or per month? Cecilia, the number that's top of mind for me is 10,000 a day. So what does that mean? 300,000 a month, and for 3.6, 3.8 million a year, depending on how exact that 10,000 number. So you have a ton of new people being eligible for qualified charitable distributions. Important note, by the way, that someone mentioned in the chat, 72 is when you have to start taking these distributions. By the time you are 70 and a half, I know a little bit confusing, that's when you can start giving qualified charitable distributions. So it's still pre-tax money, still very beneficial for all your folks over 70. All right, last question. If you were to promote one non-cash gift during the summer, what would it be? Obviously planned gifts are just enormously valuable. I mean, the size of these gifts from ordinary donors often ends up being 6 digits or more. We see $1 million donors, $1 million plan giving donors from people who might have otherwise given $50. And so, obviously bequests, if you think about a real-time gift, probably stock giving. Stock giving is still the dominant major gift when you can get folks to move away from cash and into stock. They are way better off for a bunch of tax reasons that we didn't get into today, and you will be much better off because these gifts will be enormous. So with that, we will end about 10 minutes early, just to give you all a little bit of time back before the next session. But a huge thank you to you all for joining. Thank you so much for those of you who filled out the survey. We know that most of you fill it out. But really appreciate you taking the time to spend with us, to push your organization forward, to push your career forward. And it's just sort of a fascinating place to be right now, right? There's so much happening in the world that has all these knock-on effects for how our work is being done that we then have to figure out what do we actually do about it. And so I hope you enjoyed this. We really enjoyed doing a lot of the research and pre-work to go into it. We hope to chat to you in 2 weeks and go a little bit deeper on really crushing end of year giving, because for so many folks, especially a couple of folks who are a little bit behind on their goals, just doing an amazing job at end of year giving is going to be instrumental for the next year or so. And we don't talk about this much, but as inflation goes up, meaning fundraising this year is going to be even more important because your costs are going to be a little bit bigger next year than you might expect. And so the work that you all are doing as fundraisers is just immensely important to your teams, to the organizations, and obviously to the broader society. So big thank you. See you in a few weeks. Shoot me an email if you have any questions. I'm at patrick@freewill.com, and would love to see you all soon.